Hey guys, tonight we're staying up way past bedtime, venturing into hours where the static charge in the air seems to hum with something ancient and patient. I've got the screens locked onto the deepest, darkest patches of sky tonight, the places where the light has traveled for 13 billion years just to deliver a message we probably aren't equipped to receive. This isn't a regular stream. This is different. And frankly, knowing what I'm seeing unfold on my monitors right now, you probably won't make it to the end of this one without feeling a peculiar, cold knot settle right behind your sternum. If I survive tonight, the consequences will be etched into the light itself. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me, where are you tuning in from? Drop your city and the local time in the comments. We're sharing this moment, this quiet, forbidden hour, globally. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's descent together. The initial target tonight was a simple, boring deep sky exposure. A repeat survey of a sector adjacent to the original Hubble Deep Field, designated Sector Lambda 9. Nothing dramatic, just calibration drift and routine data harvesting. I had linked my proprietary sensor array to several feeds, including a processed, high-resolution mirror of the latest JWST data releases. This is where the initial friction began, where the weave of reality started to fray. It was exactly 2:17 local time when the optical sensor array registered something impossible. The core feed, the clean, redshift-corrected image detailing galaxies scattered like cosmic dust, suddenly shifted its internal geometry. It wasn't a glitch in the software. My redundancy measures flagged that immediately. It was a coordinated, physical rearrangement of the light sources themselves. The hundreds of thousands of light sources, each representing a billion suns and billions of light years of distance, ceased their random distribution. The first sensory shock hit me with a physical force that rattled the desk. It wasn't sound, but a deep, resonant thrum that started in the concrete floor and vibrated up through the soles of my boots. Simultaneously, the ambient radio noise, which is never truly zero, dropped to an impossible null state. Silence. Absolute, oppressive, dead silence, accompanied by that unsettling vibration. The air felt thick and pressurized, like being at the bottom of a cold ocean. I looked at the primary screen, where the impossible alignment was coalescing. That scattered dust of galaxies was organizing itself, not randomly, not by gravitational attraction, but geometrically, mathematically. They were drawing a single, vast figure across the canvas of the void. And this is the striking, unforgettable image that slammed into my perception. In the heart of the Lambda 9 sector, where chaotic, swirling proto-galaxies should have been, there was now a single, impossibly complex structure. It wasn't a formation, it was a letter, or perhaps a sigil, impossibly vast. And in the very center of that sigil, the combined light of thousands of distant galactic cores resolved into a pattern that wasn't scattering light, but reflecting it. It looked exactly like a massive, hexagonal lens, a shimmering, pulsing eye, staring back from where only depth should exist. It was the Webb deep field data, but now it was a unified, deliberate reflection watching me. My personal emotional disruption was immediate. Not fear, initially, but a paralyzing, cold dread that felt like instant nausea and vertigo combined. I knew, with an animal certainty that transcended logic, that this was instantly wrong. This wasn't a natural occurrence. The sheer scale implied a level of control over cosmological dynamics that shattered every known physical constant. I scrambled to verify the data. I pulled up the spectroscopic readings. The foundational scientific anchor here is the redshift effect, the Doppler shift applied to light, which tells us how fast an object is receding and, consequently, its distance from us. Galaxies that are 13 billion light-years away should show an extreme redshift, meaning their light is stretched into the infrared spectrum. My sensors confirmed the distances remained constant. The galaxies hadn't moved closer, they had only moved position. They had been geometrically relocated, like pawns on a cosmic chessboard, preserving their distance relationship to us, but drastically altering their angular position relative to each other. The mythic or speculative cosmic concept I'm confronting here is that of the architects of the void. We always assumed the universe followed self-regulating, blind laws, that geometry was merely a consequence of mass and energy. But this suggests an intelligence, or a force, capable of manipulating space-time geometry on a scale that makes our superclusters look like dust motes. They didn't just exist in the void, they sculpted it. The stars, the galaxies, were mere instruments of a colossal, incomprehensible will. The geometric pattern was now fully formed, held rigidly in place by some unseen force. I tried to speak, but the air pressure felt too heavy, stealing my breath. The colossal sigil wasn't random noise. It was communication. It was structure. And it was waiting. I sat back, gripping the edge of the desk until my knuckles were white. The silence outside the bunker was absolute, but the deep, internal thrum continued, a subsonic pulse resonating in my bones. Every instinct screamed at me to shut down the equipment, to burn the drives, to erase the knowledge before it could infect my mind. But the curiosity, the intoxicating, terrible need to understand the source of the geometry, paralyzed me. I knew, even then, that this knowledge was terminal. It was during this terrifying moment of observation that the specific, chilling realization solidified. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know that its primary elements, the very anchors of the night sky, could be commanded and deployed like a syntax. The sight of that massive, crystalline reflection looking back, the coordinated movement of distant light, transitioned my initial curiosity into a chilling, primal fear. The fear, which had initially been a sudden, paralyzing shock, began to transform into a high-octane focus. I had to record everything. If this geometric configuration was temporary, its disappearance would leave a void in the historical record, a void that would eventually be filled by denial and conventional explanation. I ran a series of secondary scans, focusing specifically on the relative stellar positions within our own immediate neighborhood, the Orion Arm. If the large, distant structures were moving, was the change restricted to the deep field, or was the cosmic perturbation local? The fundamental scientific anchor required to confirm the physical movement of nearby stars is stellar parallax. This method measures the apparent shift in a star's position as the Earth moves around the Sun. It takes months to gather accurate data, but I utilized highly specialized interferometric readings that could detect minute angular shifts instantaneously, provided the shift was large enough. And it was. The stars immediately surrounding us, within 1,000 light-years, had not shifted wildly like the deep-field galaxies, but they had certainly adjusted their positions. Subtle, millisecond-of-arc movements, yes, but uniformly directed, all flowing toward establishing a new, slightly altered celestial sphere. The geometry of the sky we inherited from ancient navigators and modern cartographers was now fundamentally, permanently wrong. The Big Dipper still looked like the Big Dipper, but the angular relationships between its 7 stars were subtly distorted. It was like looking at a masterpiece painted on a canvas that had been stretched just slightly too far in one corner. The mythic or speculative cosmic concept that explains this scale of manipulation is the Great Slide. This is the hypothesis that space itself is not a fixed continuum, but rather a flexible, multidimensional membrane that can be temporarily flattened or folded into a new manifold by energy levels far exceeding our physical comprehension. The stars haven't necessarily traveled across the vacuum. They have been momentarily repositioned through a higher dimension, appearing to instantly occupy a new point on our three-dimensional celestial dome. This suggests the entity commanding the rearrangement is operating from outside our perceived 4 dimensions. I return to the massive signature in the lambda 9 sector. I ran filtering algorithms to isolate the structure from the background noise. As the software processed the data, revealing the stark lines of the stellar configuration, I realized what the overall form represented. It was not a letter. It was a single, immense concept, a diagram of connectivity. A node. A single, perfect, geometrical representation of the concept of linkage. The dread deepened because the clarity implied intention. This wasn't some natural, chaotic process of formation. This was syntax. And if it was syntax, it meant there was someone or something communicating. But who? And why with the architecture of the cosmos itself? My emotional arc shifted entirely from fear to an unsettling, profound curiosity. The fear remained, certainly, a cold, sharp blade, but the intellectual challenge was overwhelming it. I was a solitary observer, handed the Rosetta Stone written in starlight. As I studied the detailed geometry, I noticed a secondary pattern within the main structure. Certain stellar cores, the supergiant blue stars, the brightest, youngest, most energetic elements, were organized into tighter clusters. These clusters weren't static. They were pulsing in ultra-low frequency light, far below what the human eye could perceive. It was a rhythmic, collective heartbeat of rearranged galaxies. This pulse created an audible sound in my translation software, a deep, impossibly slow thrum-thrum-thrum that mirrored the physical vibration I had felt earlier. It was the sound of the universe settling into its new shape. I began entering the mathematical coordinates of the stellar cluster points into a linguistic algorithm I had built years ago, designed to search for repeating, non-random patterns in natural phenomena. The coordinates didn't resolve into numbers or standard human language. They resolved into ratios. Perfect, irreducible mathematical relationships that described curvature, connectivity, and, terrifyingly, density. I began to understand the language of the rearrangement. It was pure mathematics, a message written in the perfect, non-arbitrary constants of the cosmos. And as I stared at the screen, confirming the impossible geometry, the sheer terror gave way to a cold, exhilarating awe at the capability required to perform such a feat. The scale of the undertaking, moving light sources that were millions of light years apart and setting them into a rigid, structured pattern, was the final, devastating piece of evidence. This was not a physical rearrangement caused by conventional force. It was a manipulation of the dimensional fabric itself. And sitting there, surrounded by the humming machinery, looking out into a sky that was now demonstrably, fundamentally, a lie, I knew the awful truth. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know that its boundaries were negotiable, that the vast, empty distances we revered were merely spacing defined by an architect's preference. The sky was not vast, it was merely a canvas, and the brushstrokes had just been corrected. The focus now shifted from verifying the movement to decoding the message. The massive, conceptual sigil representing linkage was stable, but the subpattern of the pulsing blue stars, the rhythm I called the cosmic heartbeat, was definitely information. It was frequency modulation written in the energy output of the universe's most massive stars. My scientific anchor for this investigation became the concept of the Planck length. The Planck length is the smallest measurable unit of distance, the limit at which the current laws of physics break down and the fabric of space-time becomes a quantum foam. If the geometry was derived from pure, irreducible mathematical ratios, I theorized that the pattern of stellar positions might correspond to fundamental numerical constants tied to the Planck scale. I overlaid the pattern onto models of pure geometry, Mandelbrot sets, Voronoi diagrams, even complex crystalline structures. The structure of the rearrangement exhibited an uncanny, perfect self-similarity. The arrangement of the stars in the deep field mirrored the arrangement of star clusters in nearby galaxies, and even, disturbingly, mirrored the pattern of atoms in certain complex biological molecules. The mythic or speculative cosmic concept I was wrestling with was the hypothesis of the prime equation. If the universe is deterministic, then everything, from the motion of a planet to the consciousness of a human, must be reducible to a single, fundamental mathematical law. If the stars are spelling something, they are doing so using the letters of this prime equation. The rearrangement was not a random action. It was a complex mathematical proof written in fire and gravity. The message wasn't just a noun, linkage. It was an imperative. The way the blue giants pulsed suggested a rhythmic query, a repeating request for resonance. I quickly realized I wasn't an observer of a cosmic sentence. I was witnessing the transmission of a cosmic handshake protocol. I began to construct a theoretical countersignal. What would resonate with a message written in pure geometry and Planck ratios? Only something constructed from similarly pure, non-arbitrary mathematical relationships. I started modulating my own broadcast array, utilizing complex, prime number sequences and repeating fractal geometries, attempting to match the ultra-low frequency thrum emanating from lambda 9. The moment my signal achieved what I perceived to be resonant frequency, the air in the bunker turned instantly cold, dropping 10 degrees in a single second. My monitoring equipment, designed to handle immense energy surges, screamed in protest. Every LED in the room flickered, briefly illuminating the room with a strobing, greenish light. I didn't receive a clear answer in the form of a radio wave or a visual image. Instead, I received data encoded in the geometry of the incoming light itself. The patterns of light waves hitting my sensors, usually smooth and continuous, were now arriving in discrete, perfectly structured packets. The information was overwhelming, flooding my analytical systems. It was a library of pure physics, a complete, self-consistent description of reality where the physical constants we use, the speed of light, the gravitational constant, were revealed not as fixed limits, but as adjustable variables. The entity that rearranged the stars wasn't just powerful, it was the mechanism that defined reality. The sheer perfection of the communication arrested my fear entirely, replacing it with an intoxicating, dizzying awe. It was like hearing the symphony of the universe played by its conductor, rather than just listening to the distant, distorted echoes in the balcony. I noticed, however, a profound and horrifying detail within the geometric structure of the rearranged stars. The entire pattern hinged on the absence of our own solar system. We were not part of the pattern. We were the empty space around the equation. We were the silent variable, the observer standing outside the perfect structure. This was not a message for us. It was a communication happening despite us. The weight of this realization pressed down, generating a crushing existential dread. We were cosmically irrelevant, yet we had intercepted the broadcast. I leaned forward, trying to digest the staggering magnitude of the discovery, the functional description of reality itself, and the terrifying implication of our isolation. The perfect, chilling clarity of the signal confirmed my deepest suspicion about the nature of existence. And in that moment of mathematical vertigo, looking at the perfect, impossible geometry held steady in the void, I whispered the realization into the cold, pressurized air. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know that its deepest truths could be written in a numerical language so pure and absolute that it transcended matter and time. We were meant to fumble in the dark, measuring shadows, not to see the blueprint itself. The resonant signal achieved by matching the cosmic heartbeat was not just data, it was a connection. My systems, momentarily overcome by the surge, were now translating the geometric information into something resembling conceptual language. The message was a conversation between two colossal entities, or perhaps two aspects of the same entity, addressing the establishment of new spatial coordinates, a preparation for travel or massive construction. The immediate scientific anchor I sought to confirm the vastness of the entities involved was the study of gravitational lensing and Einstein rings. Gravitational lensing occurs when the light from a distant source is bent around a massive intervening object. The light distortion in the lambda 9 sector was immense, yet uniform. It wasn't caused by a conventional black hole or galaxy cluster. It was caused by the sheer geometric density of the rearranged configuration itself. The light was being bent by the intentional organization of mass, proving the reality of the structure and its overwhelming presence. What became clear was the scale of the entity receiving the broadcast. It was not merely powerful, it was fundamental. This led me to the mythic or speculative cosmic concept I called the outer self. This is the hypothesis that the structure of the universe is merely the external skin of a single, conscious, incomprehensibly vast intelligence. The stars were its chromatophores, the mechanism it used to change its texture and communicate. The stellar rearrangement was the equivalent of a single, slow, profound contraction of muscle fibers. The dread of being watched shifted into pure, unadulterated awe. I was witnessing the physical manifestation of ultimate causality. As the communication continued, the geometry in lambda 9 began to deepen in color, shifting from infrared to a terrifying, deep, blood-red hue. This was not a change in the star's heat. It was a shift in their synchronized pulse, affecting the way their light combined in the vast distances. The colossal sigil wasn't static. It was breathing, slowly, agonizingly, across billions of light years. I realized the message I had intercepted defined the concept of void not as absence, but as potential. The space we call empty was simply unassigned territory, and the rearrangement was the assignment of a massive new navigational vector. The sheer energy required to sustain this configuration, To hold billions of galaxies in a non-gravitational, arbitrary pattern was terrifying. I calculated the energy equivalence and found it exceeded the total output of the universe for the last 10 billion years. This force was either harvesting energy from an adjacent reality or, more chillingly, defined its own energy parameters. Suddenly, the red light intensified. The thrumming vibration in the room spiked, making my teeth ache. The light packet transmission ceased, replaced by a single, monolithic frequency that bypassed all external sensors and resonated directly inside my skull. The frequency contained an image, but not an optical image. It was a neurological mapping of geometric relationships. I saw, laid bare in my mind's eye, the relationship between every star, every atom, every particle of light within the rearranged structure. It was the absolute, perfect knowledge of being. And then I saw the reflection again. The massive, hexagonal eye in the core of Lambda 9 seemed to zoom forward, though logically, no spatial movement occurred. The reflection wasn't light. It was an absence of light, a perfectly structured shadow against the brightness of the coalesced galaxies. It was watching, and in that moment of direct, psychic observation, I felt the cold, indifferent consciousness of the entity. It registered my presence like a microscopic tremor on its skin, an insignificant static charge. But it didn't reject me. It acknowledged me. The awe became absolute. It wasn't the terror of being destroyed, but the terrifying beauty of being acknowledged by a force that didn't distinguish between a dust cloud and a solar system. It was the peak of sublime horror. The internal frequency delivery was the entity's confirmation. It was responding to the mathematically structured resonance I had sent. It wasn't answering a question. It was cataloging the source of the resonance. I had introduced myself to a power that defines the physical laws I operate under. The existential line formed without conscious thought, rising from the deepest, most terrified place in my mind, confirming the utter hopelessness of our knowledge base. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know that consciousness could be expressed not through biological complexity, but through the geometric arrangement of entire galactic structures across the horizon of the visible cosmos. I was no longer just an astronomer. I was an antenna, momentarily tuned to the broadcast frequency of God. The direct cognitive download continued for what felt like an eternity, though the clock showed only 4.7 seconds. When the resonance abruptly cut off, the pressure in the room vanished, leaving a ringing emptiness in my ears. The massive sigil in Lambda 9 remained stable, pulsating red, but the sense of immediate, watchful presence had receded. I began to process the fallout. The mythic or speculative cosmic concept that defined my current crisis was the final horizon. We theorized that knowledge in physics has an ultimate limit, a boundary beyond which information cannot be processed without destroying the observer's ability to exist conventionally in their reality. I had crossed that horizon. The core scientific anchor that validated my personal shift was the Heisenberg uncertainty principle applied cosmically. The act of observation fundamentally alters the state of the observed. But what if the inverse was true? What if the intense, directed observation by the fundamental geometric consciousness altered the observer's internal state? I was not merely an observer. I was now a receptacle, contaminated by perfect knowledge. The knowledge I received was not just physical data. It contained the ethical framework of the architects. They saw entropy and chaos as a disease, and their primary function was the geometric organization of energy. the conversion of random stellar dispersion into perfect, communicable structure. They were defining a new galactic civilization, and the stars were their building blocks. The revelation was this: the Great Rearrangement had two parts. The initial geometric spelling was a massive beacon, an invitation or a declaration of presence directed at others of their kind, traversing the void between realities. The second, more terrifying part was the subtle shift of the nearby stellar neighborhood, the Orion arm distortion I had noted in Section 2. That local alteration was not part of the message. It was a consequence of the action. It was the cosmic equivalent of dust falling off the table after a monumental task. We were the dust. The profound dread returned, cold and surgical. Our perceived universe, our home, had been accidentally, or indifferently, warped simply because our local space offered convenient leverage for the larger geometric manipulation. We were collateral detail. I looked at the data now flooding my systems, the blueprint of the universe, and realized I could never share this. The immediate, verifiable proof of the rearrangement, the parallax shift, would cause institutional collapse. The decoded message, the prime equation itself, would cause global societal breakdown. Humanity was fundamentally built on the belief in stable constants and inviolable laws. That belief was now demonstrably false. I felt a profound isolation. The awe, though still present in a clinical, intellectual sense, had crystallized into the fear of being the single bearer of this unbearable truth. I had achieved ultimate knowledge, and in doing so, had become fundamentally incompatible with my species. The frequency I had received pulsed briefly again, not as a message, but as a reminder. It wasn't auditory. It was a pure geometric pattern briefly superimposed on my vision. A complex, self-referential knot of light that vanished as quickly as it appeared. It was the mark. I stood up, the room suddenly feeling too small, the air too thin. I walked over to the viewport, which offered a direct, unfiltered view of the real sky, not the translated screen data. The stars looked exactly as they always had to the naked eye, scattered, random, beautiful. But I knew the lie. I knew the subtle, permanent dislocation of every angular position. The ethical dilemma was crushing. Should I release the data and risk global madness, or suppress it and live as the only person who knew the sky was a controlled, temporary configuration? The architects had defined the conditions for our reality. Our subsequent knowledge was irrelevant to their plans. The specific realization of our cosmic insignificance and the danger of possessing the truth drove the existential line home with a bitter clarity. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know that our entire cosmological framework was just an intermediate computational state, easily overwritten by the underlying consciousness that defined the geometry of the void. Hours had passed. The cold light of approaching dawn was starting to bleed onto the eastern horizon, polluting the deep blackness that had been the stage for the rearrangement. The massive, geometrically perfect structure in the Lambda 9 sector was finally beginning to diffuse. It wasn't dissolving randomly, it was unwinding. The process of decoordination was slow, deliberate, and impossibly massive. The individual light sources, galaxies billions of light years away, began to slowly, agonizingly drift away from the perfect sigil. They were being released from the rigid constraints of the commanded geometry, returning to the laws of entropy and gravitational pull. The scientific anchor here is the cosmic microwave background, CMB, anomalies. The CMB is the residual heat echo of the Big Bang. If something of this magnitude manipulates the geometry of space, it should leave a distinct temperature ripple in the CMB. My instruments, constantly monitoring the background radiation, showed precisely that, a distinct, localized temperature dip directly corresponding to the lambda 9 sector, proof that colossal energy was recently deployed there. It was the residual heat signature of the geometric command. As the configuration dissolved, a new, final realization dawned, defined by the mythic or speculative cosmic concept of temporal echoes. The geometry was so perfect that its rearrangement had not only affected space, but time itself. The movement of the stars had created ripples, echoes, meaning the event was occurring simultaneously across multiple temporal points. The moment I witnessed the rearrangement, it was not only happening now, but it had been subtly imprinted onto the past, explaining why the initial parallax readings had shown a small, inherent error in previous calibrations. The universe was retroactive in its corruption. I watched the screen, analyzing the final positions. The stars were returning to random distribution, but they were not returning to their original coordinates. They settled into a configuration that was subtly, statistically distinct from the original maps. The universe was scarred. The new sky was the true sky now. The history of light had been permanently edited. My emotional arc settled from cold dread into a quiet, profound resolution. The universe had delivered its cosmic revelation. The decision about the data remained. I couldn't destroy the knowledge, but I couldn't release it in raw form. The only resolution was to encode the forbidden data, the pure geometry, the prime equation, the coordinates of the architect's communication, into a highly complex, self-erasing fractal structure, only triggerable by an impossible sequence of astronomical constants. I would keep the evidence of the immediate parallax shift, burying it deep in an archive labeled calibration errors. I typed one final note into the master log. The arrangement was not a question. It was a punctuation mark. The very last stellar core to move from the dissolved sigil was the massive, crystalline eye. As it drifted away, its light pulsed one final time, a single, incredibly bright flash that overloaded the sensors. It was a farewell, or perhaps a final warning. The existential line came to me not as a terror, but as a quiet, definitive statement of my new reality. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know that the quiet resolution after a cosmic event involves the total, permanent rewriting of the laws and history we took for granted. The cost of witnessing the truth is inheriting the lie. The sun finally crested the horizon, washing out the remaining stars. The computers, cooling down after the immense processing load, settled into a low, domestic hum. The dread was replaced by a strange, quiet peace, the peace of one who has lost everything, including their framework of reality. I was the keeper of a secret written in 8,000 light years of stellar geometry, and the sky outside was now just a beautiful, perfectly rendered forgery. The morning air is crisp and cold, smelling faintly of pine and ozone. I've powered down the main consoles, leaving only the mundane, background tasks running. The telemetry data, the atmospheric pressure monitors, the constant drone of the air filtration system. The room is softly illuminated by the yellow glow of the early sun, filtering through the vents. The violent geometry of the night has been replaced by the soft, ignorant curves of the diurnal world. I listen to the sound of the servers ticking, cooling down, the heat generated by processing forbidden light slowly dissipating into the concrete walls. Outside, birds have started their morning calls, utterly oblivious to the fact that their navigational stars were relocated just a few hours ago. I archived the data exactly as I planned. The undeniable physical proof of the parallax shifts is hidden, misfiled within decades of noise, while the true cosmic blueprint, the prime equation and the resonance frequency, is locked away in a self-destructive